Hello, everyone. Good morning. For those of you that are logged on thus far, thank you for joining us. We are going to get started pretty shortly, but we're just going to wait a few minutes just to let other people hop on, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, so we will go ahead and get started with today's presentation. Hello, everyone that's joined us. Thank you for coming along for this presentation. We're really excited about it. The title is Creating Higher Quality Campus Community Relationships Through Data-Driven Alcohol Prevention Planning Efforts. My name is Emma, and I'll be the moderator for today's presentation. I am the Assistant Director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug, and Violence Prevention, and I'm very excited about hosting today's event. Before I get to introducing our speaker and hand over the microphone to them, I have a few little housekeeping items to cover about today's webinar and the GoToWebinar platform itself. So on the right of your screen, you will see the control panel. This is where we have a few little tools that we would ask you to utilize throughout the presentation. You are listening right now throughout your computer's speaker system by default, so whether you're listening in loudspeakers or a headset, something of that sort. Attendees will be muted throughout the entire presentation. However, we still encourage that you participate with us, and we have a way for you to do that. On that control panel, you'll see there is a little option for questions, and then if you press on the questions, it'll bring a drop down, and we would love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have a question for the speaker as we are going through, please feel free to write those questions in that spot on the control panel. And if we don't get to it immediately during the session, we will definitely get to it at the end, so all questions will be addressed. And there will be points throughout the presentation where the presenter will ask you to write in some of your input, your perspective, or feedback. So please do that whenever you are asked to do so. Also, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session. So once it's over and published, we will add it to our YouTube page for the Illinois Higher Education Center, and it will go on our website as well. So if you have a colleague or something that may enjoy it as well, we encourage you to send them our way and we can give it to them, or you can show them where to find it. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Stephen Gavazzi. Stephen is a professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. Dr. Gavazzi is also the president of the College Town Assessment, LLC, the company that developed the optimal College Town Assessment tool. So for those of you just now joining us, welcome to today's webinar, Creating Higher Quality Campus Community Relationships Through Data-Driven Alcohol Prevention Planning Efforts with Stephen Gavazzi. So Stephen, if you'd like to take over at this point. If you have anything else that you'd like to add about yourself, feel free to do so, and then we can just dive on in. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Emma. As soon as I can there we go. There, everybody can see me now. That's the picture that we use downstairs in my basement to scare the rodents away. I am also delighted to be here. Thank you, Emma, for the invitation to do this. And to all of you, thanks for being here today. I'm getting used to this webinar platform. I'm used to GoToMeeting, and I think that that questions button is a nice addition that we don't have. Also, in terms of some of the questions I'll ask you today, we might also use the chat function. You can actually type right in. I'm going to do that right now, and it says type here. And so when I ask you questions and ask for a response, if you want to use that chat function, that might be easier to do when you don't have questions and you're just responding to some of the things that I would like to get some feedback on. Okay, so without any further ado, if we get through all of these slides today, that's great. And if we don't, that's also okay. I want to stimulate as much of a dialogue as we possibly can have today. And so if there are certain things that I'm covering that you would like more information about, please stop me at any time, ask a question, ask me to talk more about that particular issue or concern, and I'll be happy to do that. Do not feel like you have to wait until the end of the presentation to ask questions or make comments. But if you all are dead silent and just allow me to keep talking, which sometimes happens with my undergraduate students that I teach, then I may get through this agenda. It won't be as fun for me and perhaps not for you either, but we will in fact hit all of these points. So the first thing that I want to talk a little bit about is my own understanding of campus community relationships, how I came to be involved in both thinking about as well as measuring these campus community relationships, or town-gown relationships as they're sometimes called. So we'll make a transition from talking about just simply understanding them to also then look at how we can actually measure them. And that brings up the optimal college town assessment. And that is a measure that's been around since 2014. And we'll talk about all the different campuses and communities that have used that in a generic way, not specifically looking at any sort of alcohol or drug issues, but rather just to examine overall campus community relationship quality. But then we'll make a quick transition to looking at the work that I've been doing over the past 2 years, which is an attempt to take some of that work that we did on the Okta and add in what we've now euphemistically called student partying items. And we're going to talk through what those student partying items look like, and then talk about the 3 studies that we've done to date. And that will include then our talking about the database that we have, which is a database now of over 10,000 respondents, and what we can do with that database, and perhaps even what we can do with that database for you in Illinois, and looking at some of the campus community issues that you have that might be surrounding alcohol prevention efforts. So we'll talk about those findings, and then it's one thing to collect data, but then the next question is, what do you do with that data? And that's why we're then going to talk about what we call the mobilization cycle. And again, there's plenty of time that we will have built in to this presentation today to discuss these issues if we wait until the end. So that's my contract with you. That's what I want to do. Also, just a brief mention, almost everything that I'm going to talk about today in terms of background is in a book that I wrote in 2016 called The Optimal Town-Gown Marriage: Taking Campus Community Outreach and Engagement to the Next Level. So that's a one-stop shop resource for you. However, at the same time, there are also plenty of articles that I also wrote, which we have electronic copies of, and those are actually free, unlike the book. So if you would like to get copies of any or all of the articles that I wrote, there is an address that I will give you at the end, and you can write to Chris Cook, and Chris will be happy to send those articles to you. Okay, so I promised a little bit about understanding and measuring campus community relationships, and so that's where we are, and we'll start with the understanding part. And this conceptual model that I'm going to be presenting to you is based on an article that I wrote in 2014 inside of a journal called Innovative Higher Education. And that was done with my colleagues Mike Fox, who is a geography professor at Mount Allison University in Canada, and Jeff Martin, recently retired from Clemson University. Oh, and Emma did not mention this, and I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning. I am, in fact, a marriage and family therapist by training, and I tend to view all relationships through the lens of a marriage and family. That's just a function of my training. And so I want to start with a little bit of information there. So here's where we can use that chat box. I'm asking you to think about the most important relationship partner that you have in your life right now. Picture that person in your mind, or maybe you're sitting there at your desk and you have a picture of them. Stare intently into their eyes right now. And now what I want you to think about is, what are the two things that help to make that person the most important part of your life? If you had to pick two reasons why that person was most important to you, or perhaps excuse me, in terms of what makes that relationship the most important relationship, what would it be? So I'm looking for just two words here, two things that you think go into that important relationship. So I'm staring at my chat box now, and I'm waiting for someone to give me two ideas that they have about this. Again, don't be shy, or perhaps people are finding where the chat box is.
Steven, I'm not sure if they have access to the chat box. It seems like we've gotten some people writing it into the question box.
Oh,
So we have two people that
oh,
have done there, so you can check
oh,
there.
okay, great. I didn't have that open. So, oh, I see trusting and committed. That's great. I like that one. That was Melanie. Thank you. And let's see, understanding and communication, Brianna, good. Okay, these are great. So people are thinking, oh, trust and emotional support. Ooh, boy, okay. We've got a good audience here. They know all about relationships. This is great. Okay, so when we look at, thank you, thanks especially for the participation. It's always good to have some comments to let me know that you're out there and you're paying attention. That's great. So in terms of then this early model of marriage and family that we have right now, we have heard from Suber and Haroff that the two most important dimensions of any relationship are effort and comfort. So those are the two dimensions, and they map nicely onto some of the things that you all have said in the question boxes. And so now, but what has to happen here is we have to put these two dimensions together to begin to make sense of what's happening inside of relationships. And so here's the typology of campus community relationships, or again, if you prefer, town-gown relationships. And you can see in the upper right-hand quadrant that the combination of higher effort and higher comfort is where you want to be. And Suber and Haroff have termed that the harmonious relationship. So you get there because you're putting a lot of effort in. And by the way, that means both partners are putting a lot of effort into the relationship. And that effort leads to higher comfort levels. So the exact opposite of this is the devitalized relationship. This is where we see low effort and low comfort. And then you get the mix. You get what is called sometimes the traditional relationship, which is lower effort, but somehow that kind of, there's a separate but equal doctrine inside of these relationships where it leads to relatively high comfort. And then finally, the conflicted relationship, which is where there is higher effort but low comfort. So lots of energy is being put into the relationship, but that energy is negative energy, and it's leading to lower levels of comfort. So I'm going to use this graph just for a second to tell you that the way that I got into all of this work was because I was the senior administrator of one of Ohio State's regional campuses, and I inherited what might best be described as a devitalized campus community relationship. And by the way, that's the one big difference between looking at a marriage and looking at a campus community relationship, is that in a campus community relationship, you cannot get a divorce. However, it can feel like the next worst thing to that by being in a devitalized relationship. So the question for me when I took over in 2011 on that campus was, well, how do I make something different happen that moves the campus and community out of this devitalized relationship and into one of the better quadrants? And again, my hope was to eventually get us to a point where we were in a more harmonious situation. So that's where you want to be. And again, this started out as a conceptual model. So what happened very quickly after we started presenting that work, which included actually at an organization called the International Town Gown Association, which was also something that I had done in 2014, it led to a lot of people saying that they responded very favorably to that kind of conceptual model when it came to thinking about campus community relationships. And that led to people wanting to know how we could measure that. And so in short order, you can see again, I wrote another article with Michael Fox, went into the same journal because they were interested in it. And we talked about the beginning measurement of these campus community relationships. Now the tool that I'm about to tell you, you can test drive this tool if you would like. It's on the site that is right there. It's collegetownassessment.com. When we work with campuses and communities, we create a unique URL for your project. So if you were Penn State, which we're working with now, it would be collegetownassessment.com/Penn State. And so we tend to use the email address code for each project. We have what is called real-time data tracking, which means as people respond to the survey, you get to see that. I'll show you an example of that in a second, as well as these built-in reports, which I'm also going to show you. So this is what the optimal college town assessment actually looks like when we're asking questions. There are 16 basic questions that go into effort and comfort, 8 for effort and 8 for comfort. And here's an example of one that is, and I should say also, by the way, there's a separate but related version of this for people in the community thinking about their relationship with the campus. And then likewise, there's one for people who represent the campus who are thinking about their relationships with the community. So here we have an example. How much overall contact do you have with the following groups of people from campus? This is an effort question that is designed to get community respondents to tell us how often they have contact with students, with faculty, with staff and administrators, and also with governing board members. And as I mentioned to you also, you get a chance to see your real-time data. That includes how quickly people are responding to you. This is an actual graph of when Clemson University used this. You can watch over time how often people are responding, and also how often people are completing the entire scale versus those who may get part of the way or maybe even just peek at it but don't get the whole way through that. And then I can't do this because this is a PDF, but if you went up to the dashboard and clicked on reports, there would be all kinds of different reports that also would be available to you in real time. Okay, so lots of different people have used it. I mentioned Clemson. People who are, again, just generically interested in campus community relationships have approached us and have used this. We actually have an active database of almost 50,000 respondents who have used the initial 16 questions of the Optimal College Town Assessment. Okay, but now we want to get to the meat of the matter here, which is the addition of the new student partying items. And so for this, we want to talk about some very specific things that we began to pay attention to as a result of the data collection efforts that we had already been undertaking. We have a real brief conceptual model that we followed. I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth here. But basically what we're talking about is we think that there are these environmental factors related to alcohol use that will drive both student misbehavior and campus community relationship quality. And in fact, part of what we're now examining is the degree to which that student misbehavior acts as a moderating or perhaps mediating variable in between these environmental factors and campus community relationship quality. So first of all, what do we mean by environmental factors? So when we talk about prevention strategies around environmental prevention, we talk about how we can either change or influence the list that you see here. So there are some community conditions that exist that are variable across different communities, as well as standards, the institutions themselves, their structures, their systems, and their policies. All of those together are what we're really talking about when we talk about environmental prevention efforts. And again, when I'm borrowing from SAMHSA work here, when you start to look at how you make some changes then in these environmental factors, you're talking about changing norms. You're also talking about the availability and access of alcohol, and finally, policy and enforcement around alcohol usage. So those are really the three kind of nodes, if you will, that normally and typically you talk about when you're doing environmental prevention efforts. So with that in mind, we wanted to add some new items inside of the Optimal College Town Assessment, putting it directly on the platform that got at some of the issues that we think are very much linked to these environmental factors. So first, and again, none of this is going to be surprising to the audience that we have here today with us, but we wanted to tap into items that would help us to locate the amount of different kinds of trouble or issues that was caused at various different places that students use to party. We also thought it was important to look at the rank ordering of what we determined to be the wildest versus perhaps least wildest nights of the week. And then third, to examine the potential problems that were related to student partying themselves, which was the noise and the trash, and you'll see some other examples. And then finally, to bend this back to the work that we were doing on town-gown relationship quality, we wanted to ask some questions about the degree to which student partying puts a strain on campus community relationships. And that was both in terms of just an overall sense of psychological strain, as well as a more specific question, as you'll see, about financial strain. Okay, so those are the questions, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what happened when we began to use those questions, those kinds of questions, with actual campuses and communities. So the first group that stepped up to want to do this was a group that was pulled together by the Prevention Action Alliance here in Ohio. And the Prevention Action Alliance has something called the Ohio College Initiative, which is a group of, I think at this point in time, 23 different campuses and communities that are bound together by the common interest of wanting to create healthier environments on Ohio campuses. And we went through a process by which we were able to solicit applications to participate in this first study. And as a result, we picked 3 campuses and communities that included, in terms of size, first, Miami University of Ohio, which is a very large research-based university in Oxford, Ohio. So large university in a relatively small town. We also picked Cleveland State University, and Cleveland State is a smaller school, not small, but smaller than Miami, very much urban located, and 80% of their students are actually commuters, so non-residential. So versus Miami University, which was a largely residential campus, we had a largely commuter campus located in an urban environment. And then finally, Otterbein University, which is a small private school in Westerville, Ohio, and it is in a suburban location. So we had the combination of 1 private and 2 publics, one urban, one suburban, and one more rural location. So we thought we had a pretty good smattering of different situations by which we could test these student partying items. I'm going to just jump ahead here before we talk about the data that came from that first project. I also wanted to tell you all that we recently completed a replication of this in Pennsylvania. Unlike the Ohio uh, uh, study, this one was funded by the municipal side of the equation. This was funded by the Pennsylvania Municipal League. And they pulled together 5 different schools and communities, again representing some very interesting variability. So we see 2 public state schools here, Bloomsburg University and California University of Pennsylvania, which are part of the Pennsylvania state system of higher education called PASHE. And then we also had 3 privates. One large research private, Villanova University, located just outside of Philadelphia, and Lehigh University and Moravian, which both exist in Lehigh, Pennsylvania, which is a smaller, kind of a micro city environment. And again, both privates with very different missions, though. Lehigh University, much more research-based, and Moravian College, much more of a liberal arts campus. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention before getting into the data itself is we just completed a second round of data collection here, again funded by the Prevention Action Alliance. And this time we went with 2 very large universities, one in a classic college town environment, which is Ohio University, located in Athens, Ohio, very rural location, and the University of Cincinnati, a very large research-based university in a very large city, in the city of Cincinnati, obviously. Okay, I think I may have mentioned that we have about 10,000 Okta app respondents at this point in time, and out of those, we have about 4,500 respondents that specifically participated in the use of the student partying items. So here's our little peek at the data that we have, and what I'm going to do is primarily present that first round of Ohio data just to give you an example of what we learned, and we're going to talk through this now. So the first thing that we see here is we have about 2,500 respondents, and they're split up here. You see that there's just a little over 1,500 campus representatives or employees of the campus that took part in this. And again, this is a conglomeration of the 3 campuses together that were part of that first data collection effort, and then just under 1,000 members of the community. Now, I should mention here that when you use the optimal college town assessment and these student partying items, your data is broken out individually, but it's also compared against the larger sample. So we can also play with that in terms of who you would like to be compared against, but the norm is to be compared against the entire database that we have. So now what was interesting when we did this was, not unlike every other implementation that we've done, the largest number of types that respondents said that their perceptions of the campus community relationship were by and large traditional. So this is just by percent. You can see that just under half of all of the participants in this particular round of data collection thought that they existed inside of a traditional relationship. Now, what is, again, as a reminder, that's relatively low effort, that's leading to relatively high comfort. The next highest, and this was the good news for at least some parts of these campuses, was that it was in fact the harmonious relationship that was next. That's the ideal. And then what was really interesting was that there were these smaller numbers of devitalized and conflicted relationship types, but they actually have a lot of meaning. You can see that if you add those up, that's just under 20% of the sample. And so there's a smaller, but as people know, sometimes very vocal group of individuals who see there being less effort and/or less comfort in these relationships. And so we want to pay attention to those individuals, obviously. Now, the other thing that's really important to point out here in this presentation is that there were really big differences in terms of the campus participants versus the community participants. So if we look in terms of, well, I don't know how this is showing up on your screen. It looks like scarlet and gray to me. But what we'll see is the left bar and the right bar, regardless of what color this looks like to you. Uh, you see that the campus representatives, which are on the left side, they're the ones who have a much, much larger number of respondents who are saying that the relationship is traditional. And that's compared to the members of the community, in which the largest group is actually the harmonious group. And so we began to pay some significant attention to this prior to having piloted these student partying items. And that's just simply to say that we always want to split out the campus representatives from the community representatives, because we've seen over and over again how they view these relationships in some very fundamentally different ways. So let's keep that in mind as we continue to walk through the student partying items themselves. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the rank ordering of the wildest nights. Okay, this is a very busy graph, but what I want to tell you is that if you look closely, what we'll see here is that community representatives are reporting significantly greater wildness on Sunday nights than the campus representatives are reporting. And in turn, campus representatives on these three campuses are reporting significantly greater wildness on Tuesday nights. So that's the difference. Although, again, eyeballing this, you can see that there's a general pattern that indicates that these campus and community representatives see things at least somewhat the same. But so the question then becomes, for people who are doing alcohol prevention efforts, and again, this is to protect the data from each of the campuses. We're making believe that we can interpret this as if it was one campus and community right now for purposes of this discussion. But so think to yourself, why might it be that the community representatives would be reporting significantly greater wildness on Sunday nights in comparison to what the campus individuals would be saying? And then likewise, why would campus representatives be reporting significantly greater wildness than community representatives on Tuesdays? Well, part of the answer to that is, well, where is this partying occurring? And that's part of what we're going to get into in a subsequent question here. So it very well may be that community representatives are going to be more attuned to wildness of partying when they can see it. And so for them, for people who are perhaps downtown on a Sunday afternoon or early evening, and they're seeing a lot of students who are out milling about who perhaps have been drinking, they may have a greater sensitivity to that. And in turn, if the campus representatives are more privy to the knowledge that the partying that's going on Tuesday nights is actually not in more public areas, but rather is in dorms and in other university located areas, then it's entirely possible that the community representatives are not even aware of the degree to which that kind of partying is actually going on. So let's watch how that shows up in some of the other things that we're going to see here. So there we are. The very next slides are actually going to be about the trouble that's caused at various different places, and that gets to the point of what I was just talking about. Now here again, we look at a somewhat less busy slide, but you can still see that the visual pattern is the same. However, This slide is also showing that community representatives are reporting significantly greater disturbances in restaurants, in bars and nightclubs, and also in private residences inside of the community. Whereas campus representatives are reporting significantly greater disturbances in on-campus residence halls. So again, part of what's going on here is we're documenting some of the obvious things that you may have inside of your head, but this is the difference between, anecdote and data. So the data here is very clearly showing us that these community representatives are hypersensitive to the kind of student partying activities that are going on in very public locations that are accessible to the general public. And in turn, campus representatives are much better reporters on the kind of disturbances that are going on in more university located areas. Now we get to the more specific problems that are related to student partying. And again, here's the next graph. Again, visually somewhat similar, but you'll see that I have circled some significant differences here. And let me just name those for you. So first of all, in terms of overall, what you do see is that community representatives are reporting significantly greater amounts of problem behavior in every category except sexual assault. And it's there that we see that the campus representatives are reporting significantly greater levels of sexual assault as related to alcohol use. And then finally, noise is exactly the same. It was the one non-significant difference there. So I want to pause here, and I'm just looking to see if there are any questions. I don't see any, so I'm going to go on. But if anyone has any questions at all about any of this data, please feel free to shoot a question to us about this. What I now want to do in terms of wrapping up the data is to talk about the extent to which then all of these items put a strain on the campus community relationship. And again, we're documenting things that you probably have seen as pretty obvious in terms of at least how you put two and two together here. So these are the two graphs. The one on the left is the financial impact, and the one on the right is the financial. I'm sorry, the red on the left is the overall strain, and then the gray on the one on the right is the financial impact. And what we're seeing is that community representatives are reporting significantly greater negative impact overall and significantly greater negative financial impact as compared to campus representatives. So the one thing that I want to point out here before going on, which we're actually writing about in a separate article that we're going to be putting out, is the interesting connection between this data and the fact that these same community residents who are seeing more problems overall, right? And they're seeing more strain and they're seeing more financial strain, they're still reporting more harmonious relationships on average than are the campus representatives. And we think that that's really interesting and significant and has a lot of implications. And so part of what we really draw out of this is this idea that people in the community, while they're very aware, perhaps sometimes hyper aware of the problems related to student partying, they also seem to have a much more broad way of viewing the overall relationship quality, so that it is not, in fact, as hinged on the student misbehavior related to student partying as it is on other things that they believe that they get out of that campus community relationship. However, if you are bothered by just the student partying, I'm now going to show you that it does in fact lead directly to lower effort and lower comfort levels. So we do, by the way, have a single item that is not part of the student partying items, that just asks about student misbehavior in general. And that was our early indicator that the higher the score there, in other words, respondents to that single item question would say, yes, I see a lot of student misbehavior. They would be the ones who would tend to be more likely to report lower comfort levels and lower effort levels. And so again, what we see when we ask much more specific questions about student partying, we see that respondents who are reporting a more harmonious or even traditional town-gown relationship will not be quite as bothered by the student partying than those who are perceiving a more conflicted or devitalized relationship. And here's a couple of graphs just to show you that. So again, this is the 4 different groups. So this is now categorical data in terms of devitalized, conflicted, traditional, and harmonious. You see that in the y-axis there is the amount of strain on the campus and the community as a result of student partying. You can see that if you fall into the devitalized or conflicted relationship type, that you are way, way more likely to be reporting a higher strain than if you were seeing the relationship as more traditional or more harmonious. So that's the amount of overall strain. And then this next graph, which is very similar, it just becomes a little more pronounced in terms of the mean of the financial impact. You can see the elevation of the conflicted relationship type, that is actually significantly different even than the devitalized relationship. And of course, both of those are significantly different than the traditional and the harmonious. Okay, that's the data. So now the question is, what do you do with that data? And so this is where we get to talk a little bit about this mobilization, this community mobilization effort, which I originally wrote about in a journal called Metropolitan Universities. Again, this is another article that is available to people who are interested in reading more about this, but this is perhaps at least somewhat familiar idea for people who have done data collection in the past. What we see here is that the data gathering piece is right smack dab in the middle of this community mobilization cycle. So what this means is that there are things that must take place before you do data gathering, and there are also things that must take place after the data has been collected. And it's a circle, right? This is the snake biting its own tail. So the idea here is that you're actually rinsing and repeating, right? So that you're going to go through this cycle with the anticipation that you're going to have some things that happen, and as a result of that, you'll recycle through this again. So the first piece of this is this awareness raising component of the mobilization cycle. So for some campuses and communities, there's clear awareness about the need to both generally focus on campus community relationships and attempts to improving the quality of it, but then also the awareness raising about the degree to which a campus and a community must become partners together in order to ideally, or at least most effectively, deal with underage alcohol consumption issues. That we see as being followed by this coalition building effort. And again, if there is already a campus community or town gown council, that's great. And if not, that's oftentimes what we encourage people to begin to do. In fact, the folks at Otterbein University that we mentioned just a little while ago, they actually used this data collection effort to build a town gown council. And in fact, that was one of the happy products that came out of that. But regardless, there needs to be some coalition building so that partnerships either can be strengthened or developed between the campus and the community in order to take on these issues of underage alcohol consumption, but also in terms of that issue being one of many that could be potentially dealt with by an effective campus community or town gown relationship council. The data gathering is a direct result of that. In fact, oftentimes what happens is the coalitions that are built become the primary way of getting that data. I'll use the example that I had in Mansfield when we did this on my Ohio State campus. We had three primary groups that we built coalitions with. And that included the school districts because we had a teacher preparation program, and so we were placing lots of our students there. We also had a very active social work and sociology program that demanded an internship, and so we were always already in touch with many of the nonprofits, and so we brought that coalition together through the local United Way. And then finally, because of our very strong business program and also an internship development fund that had come out of our last capital campaign, we also had approached the Chamber of Commerce to be another one of our coalition partners. And so those three groups, along with local media, were the ones who helped us to actually collect the data by sending the URL out to their members, as well as to getting that out in terms of the general public. So the question then is, you gathered data, and it's great data, and it's all there for you, and it's already in reporting form. What do you do with that? Well, the first thing that you have to do is you have to interpret that information. And so again, I'll use the example of what we did in Mansfield. So we immediately went back to our coalition partners, and we created focus groups, and we talked through some of the results and asked them what they thought we needed to do as a result of that, as well as to help us to further interpret that data. We also held some town hall meetings, both on campus and in the community, and used this data as a way of announcing some of the initiatives that we were going to be undertaking, as well as asking for further feedback. And of course, all of that has to lead then to the final step in the town-gown relationship mobilization cycle, which is the evidence-based action plan that needs to be created. And this is what drives then the idea that there would be, we think, between a year and 18 months in which you would go out and you would then be attempting to implement your action plan. And then as a result of that, go back and now go through the mobilization cycle again, leading to a second data gathering process to see if, in fact, the changes that you had desired to make actually show up in the data.
Dr. Gavazzi, I hate to interrupt. We do have a question.
Okay, this is a good time to take it.
Perfect. The question is, how did you determine who from the community members was eligible to take the survey? Was it regular community members, city officials, business owners, etc.?
Yeah, so the great question, and in fact, this was open to all comers. The idea that we had here was that we wanted to open this up, open the top of the funnel up, if you will, to as large a group as we possibly can, which is why in most of these instances, these coalition building efforts are so important to make sure that you're getting the people that you want. One of the things that we were very concerned about was what is sometimes called the digital divide. This is all done, obviously, on an internet-based platform. And so the question is, how do you get people to respond in the community who may not have regular access to the internet or to a computer? And so one of the things that we did in our data collection, and this has been, by the way, replicated in many, many other places that have done this, is to go to the public library system and to open up kiosks so that there is always one, during this data gathering, data collection period, there's always at least one site that is open and directed right to the survey itself. And so that's one way of dealing with that. But yes, again, so if I'm understanding the question right, our ideal was to capture as many different groups in the communities as we possibly could. Now, again, I did mention that there were some specific groups that we were targeting. However, through the media efforts, and we had gone through both social media as well as the traditional media of the television stations and radio stations, we got well, in Mansfield, there were over 750 community respondents, and we felt that that was a really good representation of the community at large. Emma, do you think I hit that well, or was there something else you think behind that question?
No, I think you did perfect. I think that's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. And then one of the last things that I wanted to point out, and I'm just going to toggle back since I was talking, you'll notice that this mobilization cycle looks a heck of a lot like the SAMHSA strategic prevention framework, and that's on purpose. The idea here is that regardless of the specific ways that you're talking about mobilizing communities and mobilizing community partnerships, the idea is that there needs to be a process that you go through and that this process is replicable. And so again, SAMHSA talks about this a little differently in terms of their strategic prevention framework, but it's similar enough where we've used both of these models to talk about how to do community-based alcohol prevention efforts. So I just wanted to simply note that visually and content-wise, there seems to be a nice, at least common overlap with some things. Okay, so I could go on and actually talk for hours about this, and so I had to actually limit myself to saying, so now that we've done this with 10 different campuses and communities, 10 different ones meaning that have used the student partying items to date, what did we get out of that? Or rather, what did the campuses and communities get out of this kind of effort? So first thing, and I think I mentioned this more specifically with regards to Otterbein University, it does help to build or to strengthen campus community coalitions, especially prior to launching the survey. So we heard that very clearly over and over again. Otterbein's perhaps the best example of that, but bringing people together to do this kind of data collection it is a great way of focusing attention on the need to have these campus community partnerships. It also obviously creates some baseline data. So, again, getting away from the idea of relying on anecdotal information to understand not only the campus community relationship, but also more specifically the impact that, in this case, underage alcohol consumption has on the community. You have a nice baseline, you have a place to start. And so when you do undertake some efforts then to do something about the student partying, you can go back and compare your baseline data to subsequent data. But also that baseline data actually helps to define the scope and the extent of these problems. And so again, to use one other example that we didn't talk about specifically, Miami University of Ohio had a very interesting set of findings. One of the questions, you didn't see all the questions for student partying, but one of the questions had to do with the location of partying being in Greek organizations, fraternities and sororities. At Miami University of Ohio, their fraternities and sororities are dry. And yet, what the community was telling them was that there was great concern about what are called annex houses. And these annex houses are the places where the fraternities have turned to party because they're no longer able to have alcohol in their fraternity residences. And so what happens is they go out and they rent these houses in the community, and they turn them over year after year to the same group of brothers or sisters in these fraternal or sorority organizations, and reputationally build huge problems inside of the community. And so that kind of baseline data was very important for Miami University of Ohio to be paying attention to. And then finally, this last point, which I think lends itself to the other 2 points, it does sharpen the focus on where you want to attack these problems. And so, finding out where, for instance, the community is most concerned about certain areas, we're able to customize questions as well. So for people who, perhaps have trouble spots, to do some more in-depth data gathering about trouble spots and whether or not you can move the needle on those trouble spots over time is something, again, that you can back up with actual data. And that's part of what we're really after at the end of the day, which is to build a more data-informed exchange of information and obviously of action plans. Okay, that's it. I ran out of time. So if there are any further questions while you're perhaps typing them or thinking of them, I wanted to thank all of you for participating, and also obviously to Emma and the Illinois Higher Education Center for having hosted this. I did promise you that if you wanted any of the articles you could write to Chris Cook, and that's his address. It's hello@collegetownassessment.com. He'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have, as well as send you any of that material. So Emma, that's we can wait for anyone who has questions. And I didn't know if Emma, perhaps you had any or wanted to kick off that discussion.
Well, first off, thank you so much for sharing all of your information, your data. It seems like you're doing a lot of great work, probably taking up a lot of your time, but it seems very awesome. So thank you for sharing. We do have another question that someone typed in, so we'll get to that. But also for the rest of you that are still with us, please feel free to write in some questions as well, as we have a few minutes for that. But we do have one question, and it is, did students play a role in the OCTA?
Yes, so students actually, so this all started, the student involvement itself started with a small college in Kentucky that had originally grabbed onto this idea that students should be in charge of this uh, this whole enterprise. And so, unfortunately, St. Catherine is no longer in existence. They actually ran into trouble with the Department of Education in Washington, and I think, unfortunately, lost their accreditation. But they had this really novel idea that's been now subsequently carried forward by many other universities, which is that since students are obviously one of the main focal points of this, shouldn't they be brought in as one of the main partners to the whole mobilization cycle itself? And so this awareness raising, the coalition building, and the data gathering, all for many campuses has become part of what student government and other student volunteer organizations have taken part in. And we have large numbers of students represented in the data itself. And what's really interesting is to pull the student data out and compare it to not only the resident data, but also even how different students view things than faculty do, and also how students view things differently than staff and other folks who represent the campus. So I could go a lot of different directions about this, but one of the other things that I did want to say in response to this question is that over and over again, what we've seen in terms of the effort and comfort is that since we can disaggregate by the kind of campus representative that people are responding to, both in terms of when someone comes in to use the Okta, they identify themselves as a student, and or when we're asking communities to answer questions about the campus and their connections to the campus, students are one of, as you saw in that earlier slide, one of many different points of contact. Students are the make or break of the campus community relationship. So if in fact there's a general sense that the students are an important and positive part of the campus community relationship, well, then that drives a lot of the positive feelings overall, more so than connections with a university president, as a for instance, or more than other representatives of the campus. And then saying it differently, the other side, which is the more obvious piece, which is when it's negative, then that tends to drive everything too. So students are really the primary drivers of this campus community relationship. They're the tip of the spear, someone said to me when they were looking at this data earlier. And I think that that's really true. The other thing that's really interesting is that it doesn't matter whether or not it's primarily a residential campus or a community campus. In both instances, it's still the students that, for better or worse, are driving things. And I find that to be fascinating.
Awesome, thank you. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to type them in as we're wrapping up. We've got a few minutes. And in the meantime, I want to say thank you to all the attendees as well. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this amazing presentation. Stephen, thank you. And for those who are in attendance today, please keep an eye out for a follow-up email that you'll be receiving in about an hour. It will have an online link for a evaluation form, and we would really appreciate it if you could fill out that eval and submit it back to us.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Emma, for this, and for thanks to the audience for the great questions.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you very much. So I don't see any other questions, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And if you guys in the audience have any questions that come up to you after the fact or anything, you can feel free to reach out to me as well, and I can help get those answered for you if something comes to mind later. Awesome. Well, I think we'll call it a day then. Thank you guys so much for being in attendance, and thank you, Stephen, for the presentation.
Thanks again, Emma.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.